Welcome to Season 2 and episode number 45 of the First Responder Wellness Podcast. My name is Conrad. I hope you're doing well and that you're taking care of yourself and those around you. You know, my goal for this show is to bring you content that you can use in your journey to wellness. Whether you're a first responder or not, what I really want for you is a healthy, vibrant, and prosperous life. That's why I'm bringing you these conversations that will give you some tools and ideas for you to live your best life. Today, my guest is Mark Bouchard. Mark is a former police officer and current coordinator of a Canadian National Tactical Medicine program. And in this conversation, he discusses the importance of mental health support for first responders. He shares his personal journey of experiencing trauma and struggling with PTSD and how he eventually sought help and took control of his healing process. Stay tuned for this important conversation. Like I said, it's the first episode of our new season and it's a good one. So be sure to watch the whole thing. It's amazing. Mark has an amazing story and I think you'll really enjoy the words that he has and the things that he talks about. Hey, I really hope that you enjoy listening to or watching this podcast and that you're getting something out of it. That's really important to me. And I'd love to hear from you. Your comments or thoughts on what you're experiencing is important. So send me an email or leave a comment in the YouTube channel or on the Apple Podcast comment section. That would mean a whole lot to me. And please, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or some other platform. Please be sure to subscribe and it helps us grow the show. I'd love to reach more and more people with this content. And I promise I'll do everything I can to continue bring you content that matters to you. And when you subscribe, please invite your tribe, your friends, your family, your coworkers, everyone you know to join as well and share these links. Let more people know about this content so that we can have a greater impact on the world around us. Thanks again for being here. And now here's my conversation with Mark Bouchard. Well, Mark, welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. And it's so great to connect with you and to actually talk to a first responder north of the border.
Thanks, Conrad. It's a real honor to join you. I've watched some of your episodes and I've been super impressed. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about you. What's your background? How are you connected to the first responder community?
Sure. Thanks. So I started as a police volunteer in about 2005. So we call it a reserve. Some people call it an auxiliary, but basically you're in a uniform, just kind of helping. Did that for a couple of years. And then I got hired in 2007. So basically worked patrol until about 2014. And then I got on a full-time SWAT team. So in Canada, we call it emergency response. But it's a large metropolitan area, like, well over 1 million people. And it's a pretty busy team. So I did that for 6 years. And then I switched organizations to our national police force. It's called the RCMP. It's somewhere around 20,000 cops spread across the country. So I did that in 2020 and got back on the emergency response team because I had timed out with a municipal or a local agency. Mm-hmm. And I did that until just a few months ago, as you and I were just chatting. I just got a promotion into our National Tactical Medicine program. So I'll be helping to coordinate, run training, basically do more administrative type work, but really hoping to help drive the medic program, which became a big passion for me within my IRT work. Because I knew that, hey, you're going to be needing to save one of your best friends one day and you got to take it really serious. But the other thing that led me to was learning about mental health. Because as I realized in talking to guys in the team who were struggling, I was our only peer-to-peer mental health support, which actually led me to do a master's degree in leadership. And I focused on police culture and police officer mental health, which was a fantastic way to learn so much about the topic and read a ton of the science and literature out there, combine it with some, personal experiences and what I was seeing in others. And then I combined it all together in a book that I wrote called Setting My Sights on Stigma, which is just meant to be my way to help change the culture and to help our officers.
Well, we have a lot to unpack there, but I want to back up. For those of us who are in the U.S. and we think of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we think of these guys in red suits and shiny boots. Can you talk a little bit about what that is, what the RCMP actually does?
Yeah, thanks. So the RCMP, it's such a large organization. We basically function as a national police force, a provincial or state, and a city police force.
Mm-hmm.
So where I came from, I spent most of my time near Vancouver and Vancouver suburbs. Like the RCMP will police some of the specific suburbs there.
Mm-hmm.
Then they'll have provincial mandates. So like state highway patrol, like I worked highway patrol for about a year or so as
Mm-hmm.
well, mixed in my time as well. But then we also have federal mandates. So like federal organized crime, serious crime, counterterrorism, and emergency response, which is what we call SWAT in the RCMP and in large parts of Canada, is a part of that mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So truly, like when I was on that regional SWAT team, we would do variations of what, like say LA SWAT would do. Like you go into barricades, you go into hostage rescues,
Yep.
but you're also doing variations of what a federal enforcement agency would do. So you're doing like security for high level dignitaries, right? So more like Secret Service type work. And you're basically getting a mixture of all kinds of work. So yeah, the RCMP basically does all kinds of policing. And it's really cool because you get so many opportunities. So like for me, I can do frontline patrol type work. I can do SWAT type work, but now I can go and run a national medic program or help run it, which I never would have got in a small agency, right? So it's pretty awesome opportunities for people that can get in.
Yeah, that's cool. So what did the RCMP do for you guys in preparing you for the job, mental health wise?
Uh, Truly, it's still really evolving, and I think like a lot of places down in the US, we didn't know what we didn't know, right? I mean, PTSD became a diagnosis in 1980. And even since then, the science has just evolved so much about how to treat it. So when I started my career in policing, I was actually with a department called the Delta Police Department. So it's one of the best in the country, in my opinion, very progressive agency. And truly, we didn't do anything to prepare for it, really. I guess we had a CISM team, like a peer support kind of after team. But yeah, we really weren't there yet. And we're starting to get there. So as an example, I wanted to get us to start teaching this stuff to cadets, to police recruits, but it wasn't there yet. And that's why I wrote my book. But now it's starting to seep in. So we have a national training center. We call it Depot. It's in Regina for the RCMP, where they're training like hundreds of police officers at a time. And I actually flew out there 3 times last year to teach mental health to cadets. So they bring me in to do a presentation. It's outside of the normal curriculum. And it's really just meant to normalize what we go through, like that you're a person first and a cop second. Because so many of us, we get conditioned to believe we put on a police uniform and you're superhuman, you're immune to emotions, and it's just not true. And that you get some control over your healing. Because for so long, what we've done is we've taught police officers and first responders to just repress it all, just get drunk, just pretend it's not there. And it's like driving a car. You keep driving your car without changing the oil, eventually it just breaks down. And what we're trying to do is normalize changing the oil so that you can stay healthy for a long career. So like I say, when I started, we really didn't do much, but even on the ERT front or the SWAT front, we've really changed. Now they're incorporating some of that into the program. And my new role is redesigning our like advanced care medic course. And I'm actually going to be including some like trauma psychoeducation into that to help teach people like, hey, you're going to go do and see really hard things. That might be hard to process, but let's normalize what you go through that we know many of our officers have been through. And let's normalize the healthy coping so that you can get through it.
Well, it's so important to have those kind of tools at the academy or when you're first getting into this, so you understand. So the podcast episode that actually came out yesterday, I interviewed this guy who, is really passionate about teaching new recruits, even how to have a conversation with a person they're working with, and perhaps and this guy was a firefighter paramedic. He said, these young recruits, they need to know how to tell someone that their loved one has passed, right? Has passed away, because there's no training in that. How do you do that?
That's so hard. Honestly, the first chapter in my book that I wrote, because I didn't write it sequentially, I just started writing, was about that. That devastated me. I was 2 months into my career and I had to tell a family that their daughter had died. And I had to be at the scene. So you're talking like you amplify the trauma when you see it. You're seeing this, with a horrible scene. And I won't describe it I understand enough about vicarious trauma to not re-traumatize others. But then I have to go to the house and now I see the other side of the trauma, which is actually, I think, even worse. And when I told this family that their daughter had died, the mother falls to her knees and starts praying for the other driver to live. The other driver's in the hospital. Doesn't know who's at fault, doesn't know if they're drunk or fleeing or a gang member or anything. Just, I want this other person to live. And it hurt me so bad because we carry a piece of their pain, right? And I know I actually watched your episode with Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, which is fantastic. I really look up to him. I've learned so much from him. One of the quotes I use from Lieutenant Colonel Grossman is, pain shared is pain divided. Joy shared is joy multiplied. And it's so true, because we go to this call and now we take a little piece of that pain. And what we need to do is we need to find a way to actually process it in a healthy way. Because what I did with that call was I pushed it down. And if I ever even thought about it, I'd break down crying. Right. I went into work the next day. Someone asked me about it. I started like tearing up. I was almost having like an anxiety attack. And the person's like, what's wrong with you? Like, they're judging me. But neither of us understood what was happening. And I'm shaming myself for having emotions and being human, as though when I put on a uniform, it all just, my humanity goes away. And so that was the number one thing I wanted to start teaching people, was to understand you need empathy to be a good police officer, a good first responder. Like, I've sat in on a lot of recruiting interviews, and everybody who comes in, every single one I sat on, why do you want to be a cop? And the answer was, I want to help people. But then it can be so hard when helping people is notifying them in the most compassionate way we can, right? And we're going to deal with so much of that trauma. And I think we need to find a bit of an empathy dial of when we need empathy, like, yeah, it's going to be hard and we got to feel some of it, but there's times when you can turn the dial down. And if you're just doing containment on a crash scene, like, maybe you don't need to go and see it. Maybe you don't need to know all the information. And I'll give you one example of that. I went to a call that was a head-on crash, and it was actually a suicide. Someone died by driving into oncoming traffic. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought again. I apologize.
It's okay. It's okay. Is that perhaps something that is triggering for you, and you want to, and it's hard for you to talk about it?
It can be, right? I mean, like, I've been diagnosed with PTSD, and so I kind of have that at times too, where, one of the challenges can be your memory kind of goes on you, especially your short-term memory. I remember what I was going to say now. It's learning how to turn the dial down. So, like, you go there. I remember guys were watching the video. There was a video of this, like a dash cam video, and people around the office are watching it, and they're basically getting re-traumatized without understanding. When I was a new cop, we would go to a lot of scenes, and the thought was like, take the new guy to everything so he can see it all. But really, we're just exposing them to way more trauma than they need. There's going to be trauma in our job, and there's only so much we can do about it. But we don't need to expose ourselves to more trauma than we need to. So I learned over my career to be much better. If I was a containment point, I didn't go to the scene. I didn't need to go see the body, right? And I actually think if we can split the trauma, it's really going to help us, right? So,
and what do you mean by that?
Like, it's a great question. So if you go to the scene and you go and do the next of kin, you go notify the family that someone died. Think of it like the Richter scale for an earthquake. You go from like a 6 to like a 9, and it's like exponential, right? So now instead of this being a 10, it's a 1,000 because you're magnifying so much more trauma. You don't just have a gruesome scene, but now you know their name. Now you know them as a person. Now you've seen a picture of them with their family. Now you'll never forget the loved one's emotional pain that came with it. And so it's actually something I recommended to my old chief when I left and did an exit interview. Whenever possible, we should break the trauma into pieces. So I'll give you another example. When I left DIRT, I went back to patrol and I did some more field training, and I had a police recruit. So we had to go and do a notification for a family that they were now orphans. Like, tragically, they'd recently lost their mom, and these 3 kids now have just lost their dad. I never went to the scene. I never saw this person. And so, as tragic as that was, it was much less impactful for me than the one where I went to the scene and I had to go and tell them that their daughter had died. And I think if we can learn to be better about that, because often we don't, we just say it's your call, you go deal with it all. But I think instead we should look at more of a holistic way of how do we help each other through that.
Boy, I think that's really smart. And that's probably not something that's practiced, universally, with law enforcement or first responders.
Yeah. And truly, like, that's why I wrote my book, was to share those kind of lessons. Like, and that's why the first chapter I wrote, it's actually chapter 4 in my book, was on emotional pain. And I debated between calling it empathy or emotional pain, because no one teaches us how to handle that. And there are healthy outlets. For me, journaling was so important. And if you told me 20 years ago that I'd be into journaling and yoga and gardening and all these things, I would have been like, you're nuts. You can't make me do any of that. And the only reason I did was one of my mentors on my ERT team said it to me. When I went through a really hard time, I ended up off work on stress leave, and like I failed a psych exam. Like I couldn't function in life at all. And he had told me it helped him. And I had so much trust in him that I tried it. And within months, I got better. Now, that wasn't the only thing. I went to see a psychologist. I did lots of other good too. But I think if we can normalize those healthy coping strategies, we can start to change the outcomes. And I've heard that directly from some of the best psychologists that I know, like world leading researchers, who say, yes, if we can adjust our culture, change how we see the problem, and change how we react and how we help ourselves, we can change our outcomes. And I really believe in that mission. I believe in even the good you've done with your documentary. That's how culture changes, is we make it safe to talk about things that weren't safe before. So I really want to commend you for the work that you've done on this too. I think it's super important.
Thank you so much. And it's outcomes that are really where the rubber meets the road, because that's what we see, right? We see those outcomes. We see the negative outcomes, and we see some of those stories on the evening news, where perhaps people in the first responder community haven't been taking care of themselves and doing the hard work, and that ends up on the evening news because of those outcomes, because of the results of their lack of doing the work.
Yeah, I think a lot of police misconduct is also tied into police mental health.
Sure.
When you hear about an officer getting arrested for impaired driving, getting a domestic assault charge, all those kind of things, even on duty, like excessive use of force, it's often that this person is overwhelmed with pain, is traumatized, and then it shows up in all these kind of ways. And we need to teach a culture that changes that ahead of time.
And surely they didn't start that way, right?
Exactly. We are hiring people. They're passing psych exams. We're hiring people, really good people. So there's some research out of, it's called CIPSRT. CIPSRT is the acronym in Canada. And they are running a research project out of our National Research Center. So it's a longitudinal study over years studying police officer mental health. And what they're finding when they look at the actual police applicants is that they score higher on all positive attributes. Like whatever you think of as like a good person, the kind of person you want in a police officer, those are the people that we're hiring to be police officers. But over time, and they actually show up with better mental health and more resilience, but over time, they have much worse mental health outcomes. And they're finding over 50% would meet the diagnostic criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition. And we often talk about PTSD, but we rarely hear talk about anxiety disorders, depression. Like depression is probably even bigger than PTSD, but it's not the buzzword to be talked about.
Sure.
So that same researcher who's leading that study is the one that told me. It's Dr. Nick Carlton. And he said, hey, if we can change what was normal in our culture, how we see this problem. And I think it even ties into stigma, because we often look at stigma as like, oh, how do we fix this big mythical stigma out there? Stigma really starts with self-stigma and our own perception of ourselves. We show up like, oh yeah, I don't have a stigma. Like, if people are injured, that's okay. I'm okay with it. But when it's us, we shame ourselves. It's hard to go through trauma symptoms. I had terrible night terrors. That's really hard. But it's even worse when you're shaming yourself for being weak and that there's something wrong with you. And if we can teach people that it's okay to be human, that's really going to help them. And I'll give you one more example. There's a guy I teach at Depot with on the mental health presentations, and he's been in numerous police shootings. I really look up to him as a police officer. He's a fantastic police officer, a very good person. And he says the most courageous thing he ever did was ask for help. And I tell him, these police officers won't ever have to say that because they heard this from you, that this now becomes that much easier for them when they need help to say, hey, I'm struggling. Hey, I'm having nightmares. Hey, whatever ways it's showing up in their life, to get help because you made it okay for them to be human. You're sharing that lesson with them. And that's really powerful.
I look at that as not a sign of weakness. It's actually, it takes a lot of strength to say, hey, I have a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's like Brene Brown talks about, I'm a big reader. Brene Brown talks about courage and vulnerability. It takes courage to be vulnerable. And both myself and that other officer, we share our hardest moments. I share what it's like to basically be addicted to alcohol and unable to stop. I woke up one morning, I'm like, man, I need to quit drinking. And I literally said, I can't. And it's Tuesday at 9 a.m. And I had to break it down into the smallest possible goal. I literally was like, can you not drink for an hour? Yeah, I can do that. 1 hour. I don't usually drink in the morning. I would drink at night because that's when the nightmares come. But that's how hard it can get. And I think it's so important that we share what that's like and basically impart that wisdom, because we've been teaching specifically cops, but also first responders. Here's how you take notes, and here's how you put up police tape, and here's how you deal with those side of the problems. But it's the mental health side that's really been catching up to us. And if we want better outcomes, we need to proactively invest in it. I don't think we can afford the cost we're currently paying for not doing it. We spend all this money to, like, what do we spend to train up a cop? $100,000? Spend all this time sending you to the academy, buying your gear, paying your trainer. And then, within a few years, sometimes they're off work and sometimes never coming back because we haven't taught them how to process the other side of the job. And I really believe we can, if we can normalize it and normalize the healthy coping.
So what was it in your life, or when in your career did you start focusing on mental health, and why did that happen?
I was forced to. I couldn't function anymore. I had really severe nightmares. I didn't even know what PTSD was. I didn't understand my traumas as I experienced them. Like that first call I said of where someone died and I had to tell their family, I was traumatized for 10 years from that, and in combination with others. And I didn't understand it. My first, encounter with interpersonal violence in like a deadly force dynamic, not that I've ever shot someone, but I've been real close numerous times. My brain screamed, shoot or move. And honestly, my perception now was that my amygdala was screaming at me. That's the first title I ever wrote for my book, The Day My Amygdala Screamed at Me. Now, I didn't go with it, but because my brain had never talked to me like that. And I didn't even know what an amygdala was back then. I would just describe it to people like, my brain screamed shoot and screamed move in the exact same instant. And I remember being so traumatized. I literally said to my work boss, I can't even work right now. And I went home. As soon as I walked in the door, my girlfriend said to me, oh my God, what happened? What's wrong? And I just burst out crying. And I did not understand the trauma. And that trauma kept accumulating. And my coping mechanism was just drinking. And eventually I couldn't function. I wasn't sleeping. I'm up with nightmares. I'm having rage. I'm just screaming at the top of my lungs at nothing. I'm breaking down crying in the middle of a crowded restaurant for no reason. I'm basically having anxiety attacks where I can't even get control of myself. I'm trying to say what's happening and what's wrong with me, and I can't even say what. And I have to eventually just run out of the restaurant crying. And I had worked the day before on our emergency response team, and I went back to work on Monday, and I kept working for a few weeks, but eventually hit the point that I took 2 weeks off on stress leave, I used vacation time, trying to get control of myself and get it all together. And I couldn't. And eventually had to just accept that everyone around me is saying, hey, you're not doing well. We're worried about you. And, I took maybe a month or two of stress leave, and I tried to pass my return to work psych exam. I had to pass a psych exam to return to work, and I failed. And they're nice about it. It's actually the opening scene of my book where he says, oh, you should come back in another month. And he's nicely trying to tell me I failed. But it's hard because he doesn't want to make my shame and my stigma worse. But, you're not ready. It's like if I show up to work on a broken leg, same idea, right? I can't really help my buddies. I'm not really ready to deal with anything. And I only dealt with it because I had to. And I spent all these years learning about it and helping myself. And then as I came back to work and I started talking to people, and just being real. You're riding in a car with one of your best friends. You'd do anything for them. And as you get real, you hear everybody's been going through the same stuff. But no, they don't understand it. No one's ever helped them. Their wife's about to leave them and they're having nightmares and they're getting drunk every day. And you're like, oh man, we all need this. Right. And then I wanted to do something about it. And it came even from like talking to brothers and people like I love about thoughts of suicide. You're like, oh man, I thought I was going to save your life as a medic, like because we're one of us going to get shot. But now I realize when I look at the stats, like you're more likely to die from a suicide than you are even from the very real dangers of the job. And it just changed my focus. So I still want to be a good medic. I'm in a medic program now, but I'm also really trying to do everything I can to change things around the mental health side of our job.
So what was it that clicked for you to get you on the better path?
I think it was my realization that I had some control over my outcome. I felt like a victim to my PTSD symptoms. Like I like to call it a psychological injury. And I remember the last time, like I went to this all-inclusive, I got really drunk and I had terrible nightmares and it was a horrible experience. And I woke up in the morning, I felt so bad for myself. And then I said, well, what did you expect? You know that like, because I've been seeing a psychologist and they told me that, hey, drinking's bad for you. And his words where it's like you have a gate on these nightmares. And when you drink, it just opens the gate and it makes it easier for them to come in. And I kind of went like, well, why are you feeling bad for yourself when you can change your behavior? And since then, I take a lot better care of myself. I don't drink much anymore. And that's been really good for me. I prioritize my sleep. And I think it was learning that I had some control. And I went from a victim of my PTSD diagnosis and my PTSD symptoms to an active participant in my healing. And if we can get that into our culture, we can have a massive change on our outcomes.
So it's not just someone that's doing, giving you some advice and doing the stuff and teaching you, but it's you getting in there and doing the hard stuff.
Yeah, I think too, we often don't see it in ourselves. I've watched a lot of friends struggle and some continue to work, some where they go off work. And an example would be things like alcohol. A lot of times they have problematic drinking, but they don't know it and they're not willing to hear it and they can't change right now. And eventually, sometimes they do change and it's really good for them, but they need to come to that realization for themselves. You can't just say, hey, you're a problem drinker and you need to stop. Like they feel kind of disconnected from you and like you're shaming them. And often they think they can stop, but they don't feel that they can, right? They do have a problematic aspect with drinking. And so instead, I try and stay connected with them. And I try and say, hey, this helped me. When I quit drinking, it really helped my mental health. And then they can learn from that. They might eventually figure it out for themselves and change, but you can't really force that change onto people. And it's really hard when you can see it and it doesn't happen for them, right? They're just continuing to struggle. And all you want to do is like tell them the answer. And I think one of the good ways we can do it is offer to do it with them. I've done that with several people. Hey man, if you decide you're ready to quit drinking, I'll do it with you. And I don't drink a ton, but I'll do it with you. And I had two people do that with me when I quit drinking. And it was someone I worked with and the other person was actually my mom. And that meant a lot to me. And I think when we do that, it gives us permission to talk to them in a way that's like an us doing it together and they feel supported instead of a you need to do this where you in a way almost feel judged or shamed by someone else.
I mean, when you're bringing people together, I know, when I attended some AA meetings as an observer, you saw those people come together because they all had that same problem. And when they acknowledged that to each other, they were much better able to overcome that problem together.
Yeah. So like my understanding of trauma, the largest source I cite is Bessel van der Kolk. He's got a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And what he cites is connection is your number one protective factor from trauma. In my experience, many of the people experiencing substance abuse are traumatized people. So whether you're traumatized as a cop, as a first responder from trauma like that, whether it's childhood trauma, whether it's sexual violence, just in my experience, often as I've dealt with people, for example, I pull over someone who's a drunk driver, and I've done that probably hundreds of times. And as I actually talk to them, like you get them back to the station, they're doing breath samples. Hey man, what's going on in your life? Like, how come you're doing this? Like, what's happening? They'll tell you about the death of their kid, their parent, all this kind of stuff. And you start to understand they're masking pain. They don't know how to handle it. And they're just masking it in a really bad way that might cause more pain to other people. And I try to have empathy for them. I try to connect with them. But I think the value of things like AA and some of these, almost group counseling type formats is they bring people connection. Mm-hmm. And we can learn lessons from others. We can often see what I would describe as kind of like dysfunctional behavior and patterns in other people, but we have more trouble seeing it ourselves. Mm-hmm. When we see that same pattern in 10 people around a room and we take a moment to say, oh man, that's just like me. Mm-hmm. Wow. And this person did it. They quit. They got away. Like we almost have a role model that we can model our behavior. I also think they often give us a level of accountability, right? Yeah. Like you kind of need to know what to do, but you also need to know someone who's doing it with you, who will hold you accountable and be like, hey man, like you told me you were going to quit drinking because it was destroying your life. And now you're back to doing it. And I'm really worried about you.
How important was that for you to have someone in your life that kind of held your feet to the fire?
It was very important. I think the connection that I had was one of the strongest factors, protective factors that helped me recover. I was on a team full of my best friends. And I'll give you an example. They planned a training day where they did like plain clothes room clearing. Like typically we do room clearing type training and it's all in uniform with all your gear. Right. And they planned a plain clothes room clearing day just to come meet me for lunch because they wanted me to feel normal. They didn't want all these cops sitting around me and I'm off work. And just that sense of connection and that someone cared, like, wow, does that ever help? And my first day back to work, I was really nervous. Like, what do we do when people are off? Well, we don't talk about it. We can't say anything. What we should do is just say, it's great to see you. I'm really happy you're back. Hey, I've been thinking about you. Right. And my inspector, so our, in charge of the whole unit, is probably in charge of like 70 people. He sees me in the kitchen that day we have a little kitchen kind of near our office there. And when he sees me, just super excited, Mark, great to see you. And he runs over and gives me a hug. It's great to have you back. Like people don't expect that kind of camaraderie and support. They expect like the boss to be like, hey man, you've been gone for 2 months. Like we've been making do without you. Like he's going to give you in trouble. Instead, all I got was connection and support. And I really credit that with my recovery. Even my team leader, like our sergeant level at the time, he said, listen, whatever I can do to support you, you tell me and we'll do it. If you need to go to a psychologist appointment in the middle of the day, if you need to work 5 hours or 8 hours, you just tell me whatever we can do and we'll do it. That's the kind of support that will help our people get back when they have an injury. And I think often they get the opposite. They get the, hey, you're faking it, right? Which is another topic that's so crucial, is that's really a mixture of cynicism and stigma. Because in policing, we deal in negativity. We deal in the people that scam the system all the time. So now when someone's off work, we think, oh, they're just faking it. Oh, they're just scamming. They're off duty mad. Like we need to get rid of those because the stats are showing that actually we have a massive proportion of traumatized police officers and first responders. I've watched friends show up and I'll say to them, like, what's wrong, man? You look terrible. And they're like, I didn't sleep at all last night. Like they're just from nightmares and trauma, but yet they still show up to work. I think that's a bigger problem, is that people with severe trauma are still trying to do the job and honestly probably posing a danger to public safety in doing it.
Yeah. And then they're adding more trauma to it when they deal with situations that they experience during the day, right?
Yeah. So how do we find a way to incorporate people back in a way that they can, right? What can you do? You may not be able to do everything right away or even ever, but there's lots of civilian positions. There's lots of transcription and all kinds of other things where you can find a way to contribute. And as you get that sense of connection, it's probably going to help you heal and potentially get back. Like I look at where I was 10 years ago, like I couldn't function. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't not be drunk. And now like I'm back to actually probably better than I was before, right? That's almost like that post-traumatic growth kind of concept where you can, if you take the time to heal from what stresses you, what hurts you, you can grow even stronger from it. And again, that would be a really positive thing within our culture to adopt that mindset.
I want to touch on something you kind of spoke briefly about. So yesterday I was at a conference and we were talking about when you feel supported, when an organization, when leadership supports their people, you want to come to work, you want to perform, you want to do the things that you're supposed to be doing, and it's going to help with retention. It's going to help with even hiring. When you have an organization that supports their people. Can you speak to that and how important is that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's huge. Feeling supported matters so much. I'll give you a story from my experience on what that looked like. When I was off work, I was told if anyone ever knows you have a PTSD diagnosis, you'll be immediately removed. You'll never be allowed to work like SWAT or work again. And you probably never be allowed to work patrol. Like you might, if you come back, they'll put you in a closet somewhere, checking weather emails and just finding the least meaningful thing you could ever do. So I was really afraid of that. And I went and talked to our inspector in charge of IRT, who was incredibly supportive. And I went right to the chief of police. So my agency back then had about 200 cops. You add in civilians, like hundreds of people. And I just said, like, I'm really struggling and I want to get better. And when I come back, I want to be allowed back. And I'm really afraid that I won't be. And I was HR, like human resources, was trying to make me file like a work safe injury claim so they can get coverage. And I had a lot of distrust in that process and that some outsider was going to tell me when I could come back and what I could do. And I refused. So I asked for the chief's support with that. And he just said, Mark, we'll do everything we can to support you. When you're healthy, when you're ready, we're excited to have you back. Let me know what I can do. That goes so far, right? That's from the top. So if you have some boss who doesn't get it in between, like it really doesn't matter because they don't have the power to kick you out of the organization. And I think too often when we treat people as, oh, they're just a problem, let's get rid of them. What are we saying to everybody else there? We're spreading stigma.
Sure.
We're making sure that no one else will ask for help. And if we want to reform our culture, we want to have better outcomes, less, cops getting in trouble, less people off work on the long term. Yeah, having a healthy culture where officers feel safe and supported, that they can get the help they need, will dramatically improve our outcomes.
And how can you convince, city leaders, here in the US, police chiefs work at the pleasure of the mayor. How can you convince those city leaders to invest resources to help those in law enforcement and first responders to be healthy?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And I think there's a real kind of debate about policing in society. And a lot of it is so misinformed. We use aggregate statistics of police shootings and we say, oh, see, that's bad policing. They failed to de-escalate. And it's policing is often used as a political kind of football to the detriment of policing. So I think within the profession, we need to be really aggressive about using education to actually get out there and teach people about policing. That includes what I would call educating up the chain of command. So I'll give you an example, slightly different. But when I was first in the SWAT work, we would do like set up for hostage rescue, and we would be denied our best entry method, which basically because it had explosives. So they would say, no, you're going to ram the door. And then if that doesn't work, then you'll go try and get some explosives. But truly by that time, everyone's dead, right? And that's why you don't do it that way. But our leaders wouldn't let us do it because they didn't understand. So what we had to do was set up training events and actually show them what we're talking about. And I use that as my example because I think that's the comparable for our civilian oversight. And I don't just mean the actual police oversight. I mean like the mayors.
Sure.
They're in charge of the budget. They need to know where that money's going and why it's smart to spend it this way. And so it's on us to teach them. And I'd say it doesn't start with just the mayor. It starts with the public. Yeah. And what I see some departments do, both in Canada and the US, is they put out like videos and they'll explain things. So often historically what policing has done, there's an incident, there's a shooting, there's some sort of thing. It hits the news And the news tells one side of the story, and that's all that's out there. And then the public, so, oh, see, look, a bad cop did bad police work, and we need to get rid of these cops. We need to defund them. And we got to be just as aggressive about telling the truth. So if there's a body cam, put it out, and put it out with an expert explanation and say, here's our training, here's why we did it. And I will tell you, in my opinion, 99 point something % of the time, the officer actually did a really good job. They followed training, they followed law, they followed policy. And if we can tell the public that, we can build that support. But often we just leave this void. And as the public perception of police starts to kind of turn against them, that's when like the mayor, the council, they feel the pressure of the public. Sure. So it's a really long-term thing. And I think we have to see it as a priority and do a lot more of it.
And sometimes it's those loud voices the loudest voices get heard, right? And so if you have a very small group of people that are shouting loudly, they're going to be on the evening news. They're going to be the ones that get heard. And so I guess we have to counter that with an equally loud voice sometimes to say, hey, this is how it really is.
Yeah. My chapter 5 in my book is about police culture and anti-police culture. And I go into some of those examples. So if you look at like the Dallas shooting where numerous officers were killed, like that Micah Johnson, the shooter, believed like there was a problem that all these white cops were killing black people, and he was doing righteous good by stopping it. It's on YouTube. You can watch his negotiation with the hostage negotiator. It shows the impacts on society. There's another case, I forget exactly where, I think it's in LA, where 2 deputies were ambushed by like a gang member who's carjacking people, doing terrible things. And people show up chanting, like, we hope they die, about the cops outside the hospital. That's some of what the anti-police narrative, and it's often very misinformed with partial information. So for example, they'll use things like, well, the cops have grenade launchers. It's like, well, hold on a minute. Technically, you are right. I have a grenade launcher, but no grenade. Now, why is that? Because I can pepper spray someone inside a house from outside and safely get the guy with the gun to surrender, which is way better than the alternative. But when we say it in isolation, oh, those cops, they got all this military gear. It's like, that's not accurate. But we need to teach the public, even this militarization of the police. It's such a problematic term because if you look at what it is, so think of the North Hollywood shootout. Many people will have heard of this. 2 men with AK-47s robbed a bank and spent 40 minutes shooting up like downtown, like thousands of rounds.
These guys with the full body armor that were,
is the 90s. And the police were responding with revolvers.
Right.
Anyone with any knowledge of firearms and tactics and military will realize that's terrible. So the people charged with keeping us safe couldn't.
I think they had to go into a local gun shop to get some rifles or something to use to kind of end the situation.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll give you another example. That happened up here. A very similar case happened near where I work, where these 2 brothers went and did the same thing. They basically just robbed a bank to pick a fight with the police. The ERT team showed up and they came out and had a big shoot it up and shot numerous officers. But instead of a 40-minute shootout with like 20 people getting injured, including many civilians, and we can't even keep the public safe, it was limited to just the officers who were shot, and it ended much more quickly with much more safety to the public. Now that's because the officers actually already had long guns, right? And armor and stuff like that. So the public is often misled about, well, if we could just get the guns away from the cops, if we could just get, long guns and tanks, they often like to say, I don't know of a tank in policing. I know of armored vehicles. I know of many times that they've been shot at, that they've used to rescue people. And even when someone comes out to shoot us and they just see an armored vehicle and then they give up the gun and they give up, where it's just used from prevention. It's not even shot at. So, but the public doesn't hear that side. And I think often politicians will use that policing concept to their detriment and to the detriment of society. And I'll give you one last point on this. Within the policing community, there's it comes from Sir Robert Peel, and his concept was the public are the police and the police are the public. And what we need to understand is the police aren't going there to do that to them. They're doing that for us. They're there to keep us safe. That's the number one job of the police, is to keep the community safe. And we need to help educate the public on what we're doing, how we're doing and why we're doing it, because they will support us if we actually tell them about it.
And I think all of that plays a role in affecting an officer's mental health, right?
It's huge. Like COVID time, man, there was so much anti-police sentiment. My wife comes from a policing family. Her dad was retired in his 50th year in policing. My wife's done over 20 years in policing. She's a dog handler. Like before we had kids, she lived to be a cop. And then having the public start to hate us and say, you're not welcome in schools, right? All those kind of things. Like to me, there's a comparable with like Vietnam veterans. They come back from a war where they go to serve their country, agree with the war, don't agree with it, all that kind of stuff. But like, they're just there trying to help. And then they come back and you're called a baby killer and you're called all these terrible things. Well, it's same for policing, right? All you want to do is feel like you're helping people. And when you're called a killer, like I've literally been next to people who someone's there chanting about them being a murderer and a killer, and they've just been involved in a police shooting, but they haven't done anything wrong. They responded to someone super violent in a dangerous situation. They were forced to do this. That's not a murder. It's a non-culpable homicide. It's just like someone going to war. Mm-hmm. It's like telling our special forces who went on the Bin Laden raid that they're murderers. Mm-hmm. No, they're not. They're heroes, mm-hmm. right? But society struggles to understand that concept.
So as we kind of bring this together, what is the process to get leadership, the old guard that are still kind of like stuck in the 80s and 90s when it comes to mental health? How do you get people like that to understand the importance of this, and we have to provide the resources, we have to move forward into helping officers and first responders to deal with these things?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is an easy answer, nor like a quick fix. I think what you're asking about is culture change. And the way, I got to study a bit about police culture and organizational culture. And culture is basically an amalgamation of subcultures. Mm-hmm. So let's say you have, I don't know the exact number, 18 or 20,000 different police departments in the US. Each one has its own culture. Mm-hmm. And within those departments, say you have New York police, they're going to have so many subcultures within that culture. Yeah. So that's so hard. How do you change all that? That takes years. And I think the best place to start is in places like training, is promotional systems that we promote people who get it, who are, build that kind of stuff into the promotional exams. How do systems change? Honestly, often it's like in academia, the old guard kind of falls away and a new guard starts to take their place. And that's where, if we've been training people on the right things, it's really hard to convince people. It's really hard to convince them to pay more upfront to invest in, proactive measures and mental health and things that aren't measurable, right? Like, I think policing, to their detriment, gets very stat focused. Like, okay, we need more tickets. Well, sometimes those stats end up being the wrong measurable to measure. And how do you measure a healthy culture? How do you measure good leadership? Well, truly, you probably got to listen to your officers. You got to look at things like your off-duty stress rates, or time off work, absenteeism. I wish there was a simple answer, but I think the more that people like you and me and so many others out there engage in the conversations and just organically spread the message, and it starts to resonate with people, that's what builds the cultural change from the bottom. Because I think we've seen it's going to struggle to come from the top, right? You have an older generation, like some of them haven't taken a police call in 20 years, right? You've been in management and you think, oh, that's a problem officer. I don't know how we hired them. Well, you hired a healthy officer who then became traumatized over many years, because they're still the ones going to all kinds of trauma that you don't go to anymore. So I think part of it's even like leadership development. Like, if we build a system with good leaders who understand people skills and understand that long-term planning, I think we can get there. But, it's something that I suspect will take years. I often like to say, instead of making it take 20 years, let's make it take 2. Like, let's just try to do everything we can to change for the better. And when we can, if we can't change it internally within the system, do what you can outside. Like, support people in your sphere of influence, be the field trainer, the boss, the supervisor, the manager that you wish you'd had. And over time, those units will outperform the other ones, because you'll have, like, my old unit barely ever has anybody off work, because everyone loves their job and they feel super supportive. They have a really healthy culture. So it shows up in statistics. And I think over time, you see more people getting promoted from those type of units. And that's what slowly evolves the culture. But I wish I could give you here's the magic answer. And at the end of the day, because I couldn't change it internally, I tried to change it externally, which I commend you with your movie as well. That's how it changes, is we just start having the discussion outside of the organization, which eventually has a change inside.
What's one thing a leader can do, just if they were just exploring this and trying to move the culture within their department? What's one thing they can do? Where should they start?
I think the number one thing I recommend is role modeling. Like, I think you want to set the example of what a good cop, a healthy person is, right? Because many leaders, they aren't a model of health and of wellness and of reasonable balance. I think at times people want to get promoted for their own self-interest. Like, oh, I want a raise, and oh, I want the status of being the chief. And I believe in more of like a servant-based leadership. You should want to be the chief so that you can do everything you can to support your officers, because doing that will make them be really good police officers for your community. And that's the whole reason you're there. So realizing that, hey, you're doing this to help your community. You're going to do that by helping your officers, and you're supposed to lead the way. Your job is no longer to go take calls. It's actually get out. Like, for example, one of the chiefs I really respect, it's Chief Neil DeBoard, who's the chief of my old department, just announced his retirement. And he'll go out on the ride-alongs. He'll come out with officers. It's Christmas Day, and he'll come to briefing at 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. because he's sharing some of the burden. And he's leading from the front. And he actually has a podcast on mental wellness called Bend Don't Break, which is fantastic, which helps to change that culture. So I think if you lead by example, then the people have a role model that they can follow.
Boy, that's so true in all areas of life. Just being a role model, as a dad, being a role model for my kids and now for my grandkids as they're coming along. And that's so important. What's one thing an individual can do, the rank and file, they're in the middle of it, they're maybe where you were, found themselves drinking too much to cope? What's the first step to getting to a better place?
I would say take action. That's the number one tool. My chapter 6 is all about trauma, and I list several different tools there. But the very first one I say is take action, because what you look at, if you have studies of like even PTSD, they basically have a placebo effect. So you just give someone a sugar pill, and all of a sudden they start to get better. Why? Because now they're taking action to do something to help themselves, even though that action isn't actually helping them. They believe it is, and now they start to get better. And that was the big change for me, of going from the victim to what's happening to me to in some control in my situation. And taking action can be, anything. It's joining AA. It's, hey, I'm going to quit drinking, or I'm going to connect with someone. I'm going to learn about it. Just anything that creates positive momentum, positive change, I think will help you. And there's so many different ways. It could be, some people go do psychedelic treatment. Some people go do talking to a psychologist, like equine therapy, surf therapy. Like, there's so much you can do. And what will work for me and what will work for the officer next to me can be quite different. Like, I could try one thing, didn't help me at all, but then go try something else. If you try enough things, 100%, you're going to find something that starts to help you. It may not be the perfect answer. It may not completely fix your problems, but you will start to see improvement. And if you keep following that road, your life's going to get so much better over time.
Well, that's great advice. Where can people find you? Where can they find your book? How can they get their hands on it?
Yeah, thanks, Conrad. So my book's on Amazon. It's called Setting My Sights on Stigma, Thoughts from an Injured Mind. I have a website. It's my name, just markbouchard.ca. So it's Mark with a K, MarkBouchard. I'm on social media. You can find me. I don't do a ton on there, but like LinkedIn's probably the one I do the most. If anyone wants to come find me, my name's either just generally Mark Bouchard or Mark Bouchard52. And I'd say, my website, my social media, and Amazon would be the best place to find me.
Awesome. So any final words for our audience?
Yeah, I'll say, thanks for having me on. I really believe in what you're doing. I watched your show recently and was really blown away at how good it is.
Thank you.
So thanks for what you're doing. And I believe in a better future. honestly, trauma, PTSD, mental health, all this stuff, there really is a lot of good science that's evolving. We can have a better future. We can keep ourselves healthy. And you talked about things like parenting and being a grandparent. Like that's the reason we're doing this. I got 2 young kids too, and I want to be a good dad, and I want to be around for them, and I want to have a nice, happy life and happy retirement. You deserve one too if you're listening to this. So take action to learn about it and to take care of yourself so you can be there for your family and your loved ones.
Super. And we'll close with that. Thanks, Mark, for joining me today on the show. Thanks for the work you're doing up there in Canada. I look forward to connecting with you soon, and hopefully we can bring the PTSD 911 documentary up to your neck of the woods sometime soon. So for all your listeners out there and watching this show, please be on the lookout for future events and dates in Canada. And so if you're Canadian, please reach out and let me know that you're listening. I'd really appreciate that. Hey, be sure to check out the PTSD 911 screening events we're having around the country. I look forward to connecting with many of you in person. And if you'd like to host an event, please visit our website at ptsd911movie.com and fill out the screening form. And I look forward to getting back to you and talking to you about that. Hey, thanks so much for listening and for watching. And remember that you are not alone. And if you need someone to talk to and you don't have anyone you can connect with, dial 988 for help. And until next time, be well, take care of yourself and those around you, and go out and do something great in the world.